On this episode of China Unscripted, America defeated the Soviet Union and won the Cold War. But in a false sense of security, the U.S. helped communist China rise. Find out why America embracing communist China was America's greatest strategic failure. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
Joining us once again is Captain Jim Fanell, former Director of Intelligence and Information Operation for the U.S. Pacific Fleet and co-author of the new book, Embracing Communist China. Jim, thanks for joining us today in person.
It's great to be back.
And despite the title of the book, it's about why we should not be embracing communist China, correct?
Yeah, the second half of the title is Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure.
Ah, there you go. I should have read that. That was an important caveat. Yeah, sorry, Jim. I'm basically a millennial. I only have the attention span to read the bright red thing, and then it's just I'm done.
Yeah.
Yeah, I assumed it was that we haven't embraced communist China hard enough.
I mean,
and then I read the subheading, which I usually don't get that far in a book.
I mean, you have the nice people with the handshake. I wish people had collars on their sleeves of the country they belong to. It would make things a lot easier. You just know what team they're playing for.
What if you're one of those billionaires at Davos and you're a citizen of the world?
Then you just have a dollar bill or $100 bill cuffling.
Or the UN flag.
That might be more accurate. So, yeah. So take us through the book. The premise is that the U.S. has sort of succeeded its place as a global superpower, sort of this end of history thing, and embraced communist China. And now communist China is on the rise.
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. It's a real honor to be back with you guys in your secret location. My co-author, Dr. Brad Thayer, and I was really an honor to work with him. But our thesis is that we, the American national security community, failed to do our duty, which was to recognize threats as they were emerging. And in this case, it was the People's Republic of China. And, you know, if you go back to World War II, the 1947 National Security Act directed the creation of the Pentagon, right? And the creation of the Department of Defense and Central Intelligence Agency. And it was all kind of a post-World War II, okay, we've got attacked on December 7th, and we didn't see that coming. It cost us dearly, 5 years of war, thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of dead around the world, and we don't want to go through that again. So we're going to organize ourselves to not be surprised again. And then that same organization fought and won a Cold War against the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And as that event occurred, and you mentioned the end of history, and when the wall came down and all that happened in 89 and 91, in that period, we basically believed this thesis by Francis Fukuyama that the end of history had occurred and that the democracy had won and there was nothing left for us to do but just to enjoy the fruits of our labor, if you will. And what we forgot is that communism never rests. And that communism never sleeps. And as we talked earlier about in the Navy, you know, rust never sleeps. Mm-hmm. Rust is always on a ship. You'll always have to get after it. You can never let your guard down. But we did when it came with China. And so we didn't perceive that the Chinese Communist Party and what their goal was, their strategic goal, was to displace the United States and put themselves in position of power, global power.
Right. Well, when you say we, because you were doing naval intelligence, and you must have seen some of these threats rising, you know, in your work, right?
Right. Well, we did, and I did in my career, and I, you know, tried to be as vocal as I could about warning. But I think what we bring out in the book is that there were other people back in the early '90s that were making these warnings. Guys like Bill Triplett and others that we call Bill out in the book for that and what he did. And he had written a book himself with his co-author, and that was out there, and people ignored those threats. And we document how the intelligence community failed in what we call this thing of threat deflation. But before we get into threat deflation, we have to say that we basically bought into this idea mentally that there was no threat. And then we failed to prepare. You can't prepare for something you don't think is a threat. So that it was one problem, but it had two sides of it, which is we didn't perceive the PRC to be a threat. As such, we didn't prepare for it. So now here we are 50 years later, and they're threatening. They're an existential threat to the United States and freedom.
So at what point did Communist China become a threat? Because I think a lot of people only became aware of the issue maybe COVID time?
Right.
Was it always, was it like as soon as the Soviet Union fell, that was when it was a threat? Was it always a threat? Was it only a threat after got access to the WTO and got free favored nation trade status with the U.S.?
Well, I think in terms of their power and where they are in economic might and military might today, that's more recent. But the ideology of Chinese communism and what they wanted to do started with Mao and went to Deng, went to Zhang, went to Hu, and is with Xi. So they've all had the same ideological outlook for the position they believe that the PRC should be in. But what Deng did, and what we talk about in the book, is Deng had this strategy of hiding and biting. So Mao had kind of devastated China, obviously, with the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution.
But also he, sent troops to fight the Americans in the Korean War.
Right.
So there's a direct conflict there that we should have been,
Yep,
we should have remembered.
Right, exactly. So they were, and we had, Taiwan Strait crisis where they launched missiles at us and our ships and things of that nature. So we've had that was always on the back burner. But we reached out in the early 70s, and the Nixon administration made that, Kissinger's secret visit and this kind of decade of reaching out to them because we were more concerned about the Soviet Union, which was really an existential threat at that time. It was the alligator closest to the boat. And so folks like Kissinger and the State Department and others said, if we reach out to the Chinese, we can use them to help us in our fight against the Soviet Union. And while that made sense back in 1971, 1979, you go a decade later, and there's these, it's becoming clear that China has different designs, but we have been bought off by this hide and bide strategy. Deng's brilliance was understanding America better than we understood China. And he understood our avarice and he understood our greed. He understood that he could capture our elites. So he basically infiltrated our system, our government, our Wall Street, every element of the American system. He was able to buy off people, not through direct bribery, but through this enticement of, if you come to China, especially Wall Street, you can sell your widget for $1 to a billion
Huge
people.
Market, yeah.
Right. So, and we talked to people that had businesses and or not businesses, but people had business interests in China, and it was very clear that was the mindset early on. So initially, it was a national security reason that we switched from Taipei to Beijing, and then it became an economic reason. But by the 90s, there was people in Washington, guys like Triplett, that were saying, "Hey, this is not good. China's got malign intentions." But along that time, you had the Clinton administration that ended up separating human rights from the most favored nation trading status. And when we separated that out, it used to be we would give most favored nation trading status to a country if they were complicit with or adhering to human rights law and those kinds of things. And we said, no, that's not important. What's important is to buy and sell, and we'll deal with most human rights separately.
Yeah, Clinton said, we will give them more by offering them the palm of our hand instead of the back of our fist or something like that.
Yeah, which was like, it had been, 10 years since the Tiananmen massacre. The other thing that was interesting at the time when Clinton was trying to get China into the World Trade Organization and give them most favored nation status, they just launched yet another political persecution. This one was the Falun Gong one, and that came out of the 90s where they were doing their cultural genocide in Tibet. So like the things, they were pretty clear. Like what was happening was not well hidden, right? The human rights abuses. It wasn't as if the US government was like, you know what? There are no human rights abuses anymore. The Tiananmen massacre was the end of it, and now it's trade time. It's just like they were both happening simultaneously.
Right. Yeah, I mean, no one was held accountable for the Tiananmen Square massacre. In fact, the Bush administration, senior Bush, sent a secret delegation to China that month of the Tiananmen Square massacre, saying, everything's basically going to be okay. So from China's perspective, like, what kind of threat do you think the U.S. is? Like, there at no point was there any consequences, really,
Yeah,
for what they did.
we talk about this, so that they had to be thanking their lucky stars that they got this kind of reaction from the United States. I mean, we just basically invited them in. And we invited them into our universities. We invited them into our government through engagement policy, which led to this creation, which we call the engagement school. We're engaging on everything. So, and my experience in the Department of Defense was that we engaged all the time. And we had this philosophy was, well, if we had, and it's very much like a communist philosophy, the Communist Party's approach was, if I had 10 engagements in 2005 and I have 15 engagements in 2006, I must have made progress in our state-to-state relationship, and things are better.
This kind of sounds like the whole Biden administration's focus on military-to-military communications. Like that the end goal is to just have this communication. Not that you get something out of it, not that it's leading to anything, just diplomacy for the sake of diplomacy.
Correct. It was always about the relationship. The relationship was more important than anything else. As long as we have a relationship, then nuclear bombs could be going off and fires and famine and whatever else, but we have a relationship, so that means everything's good.
It's weird. It's like somebody who had like just a little bit of China knowledge, was like, okay, they like guanxi in China, relationship. So let's focus on that. And just didn't know anything else besides that translates as relationship.
Had read no history books.
Yeah.
About communism.
Well, I think it's a bit of a. I said the word avarice or greed. I mean, some people were making money off these engagements.
Oh yeah,
clearly it was their career path. It's how they lived and existed.
I mean, people talk about how rich members of Congress get, and I remember Joe Biden as a congressman was pushing for that free trade.
Yeah, but
China.
But think about how much China was so welcoming to Westerners in the 90s and the first decade of the 2000s. And I remember the second time I was in the mainland, which was 2002, and it really felt like there was a lot of welcome for Westerners. There weren't a lot of us there, and you kind of felt like a rock star. And I mean, if I were Asian American, I would have been treated like dirt. But fortunately, I was white, and I just felt like they're you could really make it in this country because they build you up, they make you feel really big, and so I can see that. And I remember we had a guest on the show. This is Ethan Gutman, and he was working in China at the time, and there was all this Western businesses just feeling like they were honored to be there. And we're just going to have so many opportunities. Later, the opportunities would come later. The money would come later, but it was definitely there.
Well, that's what we did, and we did it for a long time, and people got rich. Universities were getting endowments and things of that nature. So we became enmeshed with the PRC. So when we talk about even today decoupling, it's something that people say we can't do because it's like we're so intertwined. They can't conceive of it. But the fact of the matter is that we need to start thinking about decoupling. We need to start acting on decoupling because what we've done is we've basically, as Brad frequently says, the first rule of power politics is you don't give your adversary, the weapon to kill you. And that's essentially what all this engagement and business investment in China did, is it funded 25 years of PRC military modernization. And so we also write about that in the book, the fact that we funded the rise of the PRC. If you go back to 1990, they were less than 6% of the world's GDP, and today they're 18 to 20%. That happened for a reason, and largely it was because of American and European investment in the PRC. And then they turned around and they prioritized, the Chinese Communist Party prioritized that spending on building up their military. So when if you go back 25 years, the U.S. Navy had a 100-ship advantage over the PLA. We had over 100 ships.
And what's our advantage now?
And it's flipped. So now they have over 100-ship advantage over us in a 25-year period.
Now, whenever I bring that up, somebody's always like, oh, but the U.S. tonnage, still more. The U.S. has better technology. You were in the Navy. Let us know, is it really not a big deal that China has way more ships in it?
I face the same criticism frequently when I give these talks, and when I started giving them publicly when I retired in 2015. And people would say, well, it's not the number of hulls that matter, it's a whole bunch of other things. And they would mention tonnage. Now they don't mention tonnage anymore because for the last decade, China's outproduced the United States Navy in tonnage. You saw there was a recently released leaked slide from the Office of Naval Intelligence that talked about naval shipyards and the capacity. And China has over 13 major naval shipyards. We have 7. One of theirs in Jiangnan, just out of Shanghai, is large as the R7. One of theirs is as large as all 7 of ours, and they have 232 times the capacity to build warships than we do. And they've been doing it. As I said, they've been outproducing the United States Navy in tonnage for the last decade. And then another metric that matters, the most important metric, in my opinion, is the ability to sink other ships, or they call them battle force munitions or battle force missiles. And in that arena, the Chinese are beating us as well. They have longer range, supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles that we're just now starting to try to figure out how to get in our Navy. They've already advanced beyond the supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles. They have anti-ship ballistic missiles. And that technology, we've watched the Chinese develop that technology over the last 20 years. And we've seen them actually in 2020 do a test at a moving target south of Hainan. It was successful. And to make
for a ballistic missile?
An anti-ship ballistic missile.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they tested that. They just shot 2 DF-21Ds and 2 DF-26s in, I think it was October 2020. You have to check that date. I may be off by a month or two. And then what's more important that should be really connect the dots to you is just this last month in the Red Sea, the Houthis shot an anti-ship ballistic missile and hit a ship moving in the Suez or in the Red Sea. So the technology was developed and built and is now being proliferated by the PRC to even our proxy wars that they're engaging us in the Red Sea.
Well, I mean, sure, China's got these new missiles that can sink U.S. ships, but the USS Gerald Ford has these new electromagnetic elevators that don't really work. But I mean, this is pretty good.
They're cool though. The idea is cool.
Yeah.
So on that one, that's another area where it's not just capabilities. I mean, they have their new third carrier, the Fujun, and it has this electromagnetic aircraft launch system, EMALS. And that came from the technology that we spent, decades developing, and they skipped that. So they went from ski jump ramps or ski jumps off the nose of their first 2 carriers from these Ukrainian originated carriers in design, and now they have this carrier that is going to launch aircraft with electromagnetic system. Very advanced. We're still dealing with it. You made reference, we're having trouble with it, and then the elevators and everything. It's very difficult and new technology, but they went from ski jumps, which is what we did back in the turn of the 20th century, when we entered in the early 1900s, that's what we were doing. And they went from that, and now they're with us. And they never went to steam catapults. And we used steam catapults for 70 years. So they just said, no, we're not going to go there. We're not going to waste our time.
Because they were so brilliant, they came up with this technology themselves.
Doesn't matter if they were brilliant. They have it, and they've skipped a whole generation, which means that they've got a plan, they got a strategy, and yeah, they can steal our technology. They are, and they're using it to their advantage, and that's the point.
It's not even just built like a ripoff of the F-35. We built their internet censorship apparatus, and now they're using TikTok. This engagement gave the Chinese Communist Party everything they needed to fulfill what they ideologically always wanted, which was to to beat the U.S. and become a global superpower.
Exactly. And they've used it through every means, as you said, not just in the military, across the board, in diplomacy, in political warfare, in information warfare, in every facet of governance. They are taking what we've done and then making best of breed, adjusting and adapting for their purposes.
Now, I don't know how much you want to talk about this, but what was your experience sounding these alarm bells? How was that received?
So it gets back to this, this overarching concept of this engagement. I had used the phrase unconstrained and unaccountable engagement. So Unconstrained and unaccountable engagement is what we had been doing. And Secretary Pompeo in 2020 called it blind engagement, but the same purpose or same concept of we just wanted to engage, and we thought that that would moderate their behavior and make things better. And some people believe that. They truly, I think, believe that if we talk to them, things will get better, and we have a moral obligation to try to keep the temperature down and make things better. But there was no objective assessment. So when I came in, I mean, I was in 29 years. And while I was in and I was focused on China for a long time, I would start asking these questions. Why are we doing this? Is it measurably better or worse for us? And people would basically say, that doesn't matter. You don't really know what you're talking about. You're not that smart and you're not that an expert on China. We have these other experts at the think tanks and Kissinger Center and Harvard, and they know much better than you would know as a knuckle-dragging military officer. So it was kind of ignored. It was dismissed. But what became really hard to dismiss, especially about 2010, was the massive buildup of their military. You couldn't ignore it anymore. You couldn't just say, for instance, when they took Scarborough Shoal, you just couldn't ignore the way they took that shoal without firing a shot. And we completely got schooled in the diplomatic arena. Kurt Campbell, basically had his pants pulled down and his behind smacked by the Chinese, and our treaty ally lost territory.
Just to sum up that experience in case somebody watching doesn't know, this was in 2012? 2012. Scarborough Shoal, this reef, kind of a reef, it's a shoal. It's a shoal. Very close to the Philippines, great fishing spot. The Chinese Coast Guard basically took it over, expelled the Philippines. Philippines started sending their ships in. It looked like they were going to come to blows. Kurt Campbell stepped in and was like, no, I'll negotiate this with this incredible diplomacy. Got both sides to agree to leave. The Philippines left, the Chinese didn't, and the U.S. did nothing.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that had ramifications that we're still feeling today. And so after that, the next step for the Chinese was, well, let's go build 7 islands in the Spratlys.
Well, because I remember...
Surely Kurt Campbell, lost his position of power after that.
Exactly.
Huge mistake, right?
Yeah. What's his role in the Biden administration now?
So Deputy Secretary of State.
Asia czar?
No, he moved up.
He moved up.
Yeah.
Used to be Asia.
Your reward is
you fail up.
You fail up.
That's right. I remember, I think I heard it from you that even China was kind of shocked by that. They were like, oh, we got away with this?
China was pretty much amazed. And it gave them an incentive to push further in the South China Sea, which they did with these islands. I think it was very clear that the Philippines felt that they were, they had lost sovereign territory, and that their ally had done nothing to help defend them in the minimum, and then maybe in the worst case was even a party to it. So there's still, I think, people in the Philippines that think the United States wouldn't stand with them.
And well, it's hardly our fault, because when Xi Jinping met with President Obama in the Rose Garden, Xi Jinping promised that they were not going to militarize the South China Sea.
Correct.
Well, yeah, we're talking about the diplomacy thing. They build those islands, say they're not going to militarize it because of this great diplomacy. Then they militarize them.
Yeah, they're operating bombers and fighters and warships out of those islands today.
Yep.
9 years after Xi sit there in the Rose Garden and told President Obama and the rest of America and the rest of the world that he wouldn't do that.
Well, now the Obama administration did, towards the end of his second term, begin the pivot toward Asia. Do you think that was a sign that there was this growing awareness that maybe we weren't at the end of history? Maybe the Chinese Communist Party is a threat?
I think that was now that I look back on it, those of us that were in the Pacific were very happy to hear the president in 2011 talk about the pivot and then the rebalance of the Pacific. And we were hopeful that we would start seeing, movements towards the Pacific that would maybe change the balance of power and build up a deterrence capability that would stop Beijing's, what we believed was their plans to restore China, the PRC, by taking what they believed was their territory. But I think now when I look back on it, I think the Obama administration also had a larger issue with wanting to get America out of the Middle East. And so in order to get it out of the Middle East, you had to take the Department of Defense and, our massive military and say, oh, let's put it over in the Pacific. Now, I once worked for an admiral who said, Jim, hey, the reality is the rebalance or the pivot doesn't mean the Pacific's going to get anything more. It just means they're not going to get cut as much as the guys in the Atlantic.
But does that work? Because most of the U.S. military force in the Middle East was, ground troops, not the Navy.
It was exactly. Which is to my second point on this is I don't think he really meant that to be a true deterrent action towards the PRC, because behind the scenes, and you asked me my experience, behind the scenes was this idea that, or not idea, but this policy, this unwritten policy of do not provoke Beijing. Do not provoke Beijing. So we had already announced in 2011 the pivot, but from 2011 until I retired in 2015, you could see actions that we were taking that were purposefully taken so that we would not provoke Beijing. That was the priority of that administration, and it only was until the next administration came in that we actually truly had somebody that declared, hey, they're a strategic competitor, they cheat, they're ripping us off, and all that stuff that was true. He said, we got to do something about that. And that's when you had the people that were in his administration, Trump's administration, that really started talking about ending blind engagement and confronting China. So we were closing embassies in Houston. We're imposing tariffs. We're stopping the decline of the military and to try to restart the buildup of the Navy and things of that nature. So that was the first time in 40 plus years that American national foreign policy actually called out China and said, this is not right. You guys are a threat. And that kind of lasted, it took some time for the Trump administration to get their hands around that. And then COVID hit. And then we had a new election with the Biden administration, which is largely filled with people from the Obama administration. And strangely enough, for a couple of years, the first 2 years, they kind of went along with the Trump policies on China.
Tariffs were still in place,
Right.
Especially the EV tariff.
Yeah,
That's why we don't have Chinese EVs in the U.S.
So there was a hope even amongst, on day one of the new Biden administration, they had no problem reversing what would seem like to be 100% of everything that Trump had done. But in this one area of China, there seemed to be what was this called a growing consensus, a bipartisan consensus among Democrats and Republicans that, hey, we recognize China as a threat. And so maybe this book seems out of place given this bipartisan consensus. Unfortunately, over the last year, it appears to me that we have gone back to engagement. And so last year, you knew that Secretary of State Blinken wanted to go to Beijing in January of 2023, and then that pesky balloon popped up.
And they tried to cover that up.
Well, they tried, and so they had to delay everything. And then in May of 2023, CIA Director Burns went to Beijing. Then Blinken finally got to go in June, and then Secretary of Treasury Yellen went, and then Climate Czar Kerry went, and then Kissinger in his last trip before he died went, and then Commerce Secretary Raimondo went later in the summer or early fall.
Gavin Newsom
went, and then finally that all culminated in this big summit in San Francisco, Woodside, with Xi and President Biden, where we basically said we're going to start resuming mill-to-mill communications and we're going to get back to engagement. Now, they're not calling it engagement. They're talking about cooperate where we can and must, and compete where we can, where we should. So they're toning it down in terms of this confrontational posture, but it's really a return to engagement. They're calling it. Jake Sullivan gave a speech in San Diego in February following the elections in Taiwan, and he was meeting with some of the people that had gone to Taiwan after the election, and he used the term intensive diplomacy. So we're going to have intensive diplomacy. We're going to really intensify our communications, which is just another term for, mill-to-mill or mill-to-mill engagement, person-to-person exchanges. It has many different names, many different facets, but it's all designed for the same outcome.
Yeah, because unlike with particularly Mike Pompeo as a Secretary of State, who was very clear about the communist ideology of the Chinese Communist Party, none of this, there's no, as you were saying, there's no measurable goals. There's no endpoint to this intensive diplomacy.
There is a measurable goal, which is more meetings equals more better.
That's true. So
So
which is part of communist ideology.
Achieving that. Yeah, and we've achieved it. So you're right. We're embracing communist China. It's really nice that we're hugging again.
And you asked about my experiences. People don't want to hear that.
Yeah.
Because when the president says we're going to engage, then everybody down the road or down the line, whether in the military or State Department or Commerce, Treasury, doesn't matter. Okay, it's back to engagement.
So people who think that this is a mistake, you're saying just aren't speaking up.
Yeah, they haven't, and they probably won't. We put in the book, we talk about in terms of the Navy piece, where we clearly could see demonstrable evidence that the strategic trend line of the Chinese Navy was up, and ours was this or down, clearly down. When I joined the Navy, we had almost 600 warships. We have 292 today. So we have been in a downward trajectory for 35 years. And the Chinese Navy is clearly going up. That evidence is being reported out each year. Ron O'Rourke of the Congressional Research Service puts out a report on the PLA Navy and the U.S. Navy. And every year he dutifully, diligently puts out the facts of how many warships by class that we have and they have. And that he was recording that change as it occurred over 25 years. And yet nobody in the United States Navy, no Secretary of the Navy, nobody said, hey, what's going on here? The strategic trend doesn't look good. We should look into this even, let alone oppose it. And so we juxtaposition what happened in 1949 when it was called the Revolt of the Admirals, when we had admirals and captains in the Navy that were not happy that the Secretary of Defense, the first one, was wanting to build a super bomber and didn't want to build the newest supercarrier. And so there was a tug of war inside the Department of Defense between the Army and the Air Force versus the Navy. And the Navy admirals inside the system tried to, say, hey, I don't think that's a good idea. Let's not do that. But maybe we need to be more balanced with naval and air power. And they didn't get listened to. So what did these admirals do? They actually wrote a public letter. It was, it wasn't as like today's world where, it's scathing and stuff, but they made a statement about it, and they basically resigned. Some of them were forced to resign. Some of them chose to resign in 1949 because they disagreed with the policy of the Secretary of Defense. Well, we haven't had one Navy admiral, and I know a lot of them, we haven't had one that in this last 30 years say, this is not right. I can't sit by and watch this happen. Why is that?
Well, it's because what's interesting about courage, sort of as a concept, is it takes a certain type of courage to go into battle and put your life at risk. But I think in many ways, because courage is contextual, it takes a tremendous amount of courage when you're in a position where you have a good job, a good life, you have promotion opportunities, and then to stand up and say what you think is right, knowing that someone else could destroy your career as a result. And so the courage to stand up and speak your mind in those circumstances, I would say, is at least as courageous as going into battle. But it's because you have so much to lose, and it's so easy to just do nothing.
I think, there's obviously a connection there. And I think some of these admirals, the ones that I serve with in the Pacific, I know most of them, they're not bad people, they're not unpatriotic people, but I think they're part of this idea that they said, hey, one, I've been told by the experts, by Kissinger and the engagers, that if I keep engaging, things are going to get better. There's also some that believe that we're in this. They actually believe the Chinese propaganda that America's in an empire in decline and China's one in rising, and so therefore we need to manage this as best we can. And there's others that we don't have the money, we can't do that, we can't do what we want to do, we can't have the capacity to fight two major theater wars and a lesser contingency like we did in the Cold War.
Right. Well, in that case, then I wouldn't say it's cowardice. It's simply having your head filled with lots of bad information.
Right, and it's the part of it also we write about in the book is it's the go along to get along.
Right.
People are in the system and they're going along, and it's just this is what we do. Nobody stands up and says anything, because if you do, then you're considered to be something traitorous even. So there's a lot of factors, but the bottom line is we went from being a navy in a global navy that was the largest and most capable to one that's now second fiddle to the PLA Navy. Now, people will get upset when I say that, and they'll say, well, they're not operating around the world like we are, and they don't have as many aircraft carriers. Those things are true, but they are on the march in terms of their capacities and capabilities. And when you look back in 2012, their first carrier did its first flights on board their carrier, the Liaoning, in 2012. And here we are in 2014, and they got 3 aircraft carriers. So in the space of 10 years, they went from 0 to 60 in a very short time. And they're doing that in the Strategic Rocket Force. They're doing that in their air forces. They're doing that with cyber. You just saw reports this week. They're going to put up another 100 space launches next year. And putting satellites and things in space. They used to talk about, when I talk about the weapon systems, people would say, well, it's fine, they got this new weapon, but they don't have the targeting information. They don't have the targeting information. Well, now they've been putting up more satellites.
They've got their Beidou system to compete with GPS.
Exactly, and intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance satellites, they have it. And they're providing targeting information to those weapon systems. So in every facet, they seem to have achieved and closed the gap. We have the guy that's running the new defense minister, Dong. He is now, remember, when he was a younger admiral, he was working in the Fujian province, and he headed up the first joint command center in Fujian. And it was then before they reorganized the military regions into theater commands. So it was a Navy, but it was a joint combined center, the East China Sea joint combined joint command center. And the joint command center's purpose there in the Fujian was what? To take Taiwan. So now you got a guy running, a first time ever, having a Navy admiral run the PLA. That's a phenomenal piece of news that nobody seems to want to talk about. So for the entire history of the PRC, their military's been led by Army officers. Now we have a Navy guy. Why is this Navy guy there? Because 10 years ago, 15 years ago, he was the first guy that was being challenged by Xi and the new reorganization of the military into joint warfare to be the head of the Joint Command Center that was going
to project power
onto Taiwan. And now he's running the whole thing. So people have to pay attention to some of these details.
Now, you mentioned the idea that there's a sense among some of those in power in the U.S. of managing America's decline, that if we're an empire in decline. Tell us more about that idea.
I've had some conversations with people in the Pentagon, this goes way back, but I mean over the years where people are, in the last 20 years, they're saying, hey, it's inevitable. China's going to be bigger than us. They got more people. They're going to have a bigger economy, blah, 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 blah. They accept all of those theses as being essentially true, and therefore America will have to be, declining because of our age, not aging, they're aging worse than we are, but the population that's just, older, less capable, manufacturing's moved out, things of that nature, different demographics, different core values in essence. And so they're saying, and the budgeting thing where we can't even, we just can't make that many ships anymore. It's never going to happen again, they say. So therefore, we can't be on top. And in the nuclear arena, we see the Chinese build 350 ICBM silos out in central and western China, and we can't update our arsenal. So you see, and in these areas where people are like, it's inevitable. So it's a defeatist mindset.
And there's no sense that like this is exchanging like an American system of freedom and democracy for communist totalitarianism. There's like, isn't there a sense that like this is something that should be fought against at all cost?
It most certainly should be fought against. But these people, the same people that we're talking about, that are from the engagement school, they don't ever talk about communism as an ideological struggle. Mm. It's more it's a Marxist. It's in Marxist economic framework. They see it in terms of economic power.
Which is why they don't see China as communist anymore, because it masquerades as having capitalist elements.
Exactly.
In the system.
They never call them communists. And you have people that say, we can't call them communists. They're not really true communists because they have a market. And so that's what we're competing against. We're competing against an ideology. And we bring that in the book as the number one problem, is that the PRC is a problem and a threat, not because of its economic power or its military power, which it is, of course, but number one is the ideology that they espouse, the ideology of totalitarian one-party rule, over collectively ruling people, as opposed to what we stand for in the West and America of individual liberty and freedom.
Well, you say we stand for that, and I think the average American does. I would say almost every American generally believes that. But what happens, and I've observed this with Americans in positions of power, and especially, like, I'll give an example. So our former mayor, Michael Bloomberg, who has business interests in China, which may or may not be a coincidence. But one of the things I noticed about him is, he became mayor of New York City, and he figured, look, I'm a billionaire. I'm mayor. I'm very smart. Actually, I probably know better than all these people. And wouldn't the city be better if I told people how to live their lives to be healthier, for example? So some of the, smoking bans were the early things. And, there's definitely, a secondhand smoke effect. So you could be like, okay, I get that. And eventually it got to the point he banned trans fats in the city. It's like, okay, like, I feel like that's kind of getting into our lives a bit. And then he wanted to ban people from buying large sodas. That never passed. But what was interesting about it was his mentality, which is his mentality was, I know best, and therefore it's better to have more of a top-down system. And I think what we see as you have, these wealthy elites, billionaires who they really do believe that they know better, and that their financial or political success is a result of them being more capable people, rather than something more likely, which is it's a combination of factors, one of which is probably luck, and there's some other ones which are maybe more negative. But the point is, they look at China and they say, well, look at all these great things that China can do. High-speed rails, for example. People were in awe of that for a long time. And that's just one example. Then when COVID hit, there was this, oh, look at, China does it better because they have no COVID cases and it's spreading all over here. It must be their top-down system that has protected people. And it turns out they were wrong. But that doesn't matter because, it's that mentality that is, even if 95% of Americans all believe in freedom and liberty, and 5% or even 1% or a tenth of 1% at the top envy authoritarianism, then that's an enormous danger, and it's very, very hard to perceive.
Well, I agree, and I think that mindset has permeated and runs our national security establishment. This idea that we know best, and what that breeds is this notion that there's no competition. You can't have a competing voice. So once the elite come up with their consensus, then anybody else downstream in the system that says, hey, why are we doing that? Why are we inviting the Chinese to RIMPAC in Hawaii?
Yeah.
So, I mean, things of that nature, it becomes like, you can't question what we've already decided. And we know from our experience and what made America great was this idea that we competed, we had a marketplace, and if I can sell something better, it's cheaper and faster and does what you want better than the other guys, then I'm going to sell more of them. And so that idea, and we have it in history and in scholastic arena, the Socratic method, where people sit down and argue about ideas, and the person with the best idea wins. Well, you can't have that kind of system where it's forbidden to challenge the norm, the orthodoxy. You can't challenge what's orthodoxy. And so we have that now where we can't question why we should not engage with or should engage with China. We can't question that. It's sacrosanct. It's orthodoxy. Engaging with China is good. Anybody that questions it must either be a idiot or subversive.
Right. And there are systems in place to prevent people from publicizing alternative views. Like, for example, social media. YouTube obviously does a lot of censorship and demonetization. Now their methods are even harder to track, but it's happening. And you've got, media, most of the media companies are controlled by just a few corporations. So you've got that. You got scientific journals, for example, that would, when COVID first came, they would only report one way, and anyone who had an alternative perspective on the origins of COVID was basically kicked out of that medical establishment. So it's not just they don't want you to challenge it; they've really set up systems to make it extremely risky to challenge the orthodoxy.
That goes against our natural right. It's laid out in the Bill of Rights, our First Amendment right, freedom of speech. We have the right to express what we want without the government doing anything that you just said. And it's this partnership between the government and these big tech firms that are doing this, and it's completely against the First Amendment.
So, well, I mean, technically, the First Amendment just says Congress shall pass no law abridging freedom of speech. And there's lots of ways to get around that if what you really want to do is censor speech.
Well, on that point about free speech, we've talked a lot about the some of the elite being essentially co-opted by the Chinese Communist Party, but you also see a very big change in the American population at large from during the Cold War, where there was people understood the ideological threat of communism. You say we won the Cold War, but there was this long march through the institutions, and it seemed like most Americans also were not concerned about the rise of China. Many Americans began to develop more positive views of communism and socialism and more negative views about America itself. So this was a change that happened not just at the top, but it was also happening all throughout American society.
Yeah, there's no question that part of this embracing of China and the Chinese Communist Party included our educational system. We talk a bit in the book about military, joint professional military education, and some of my conversations with my colleagues that are still in the system is that, they're teaching at service schools, mid-level and senior officer professional military education, and they're getting folks in, junior officers who've been junior officers are now mid-level officers or senior officers, and they're finding that they're having to train them in the basics of communism because they're not getting it before they join the service or while they're in the service in their earlier schools. And so the reality is that in our school system, K through 12 in the United States, the things that you guys are pretty young, so I don't even know what you got trained in. But when I was young, the basics in American civics, our Constitution.
Did you learn about communist regimes in high school?
Yeah.
Did you learn about it, Chris?
I learned that if I read a book, I got a Pizza Hut pizza.
Okay, because my history lessons did not include. We went up to World War II, but we basically skipped the Russian Revolution, and of course, the Chinese Communist Revolution wasn't until '49 after the World War II, and we didn't learn about Vietnam.
Holodomor. I never learned about that.
About what?
The Ukrainian famine.
Oh, yeah. So there was basically the entire. There was no section on communism, and there wasn't even pieces of it.
Oh, so you're making the point. You're making the point is we have a 30, 40-year effort where our school system was, you could say run by Marxists that didn't want us to learn these things and understand.
Right, and it's not so much that they lied to us exactly. It was just lies by omitting certain things and just a refusal to teach things. And it's kind of what we see in journalism. And because I was a journalist for a long time, and one of the things that most people don't know about journalism is your editors don't say, hey, I want you to write this article that's going to lie to people. They don't say that. They never say that. And articles generally tend to be accurate, at least in the big media. What you don't know as a reader is that one story that you read is one of maybe 10 pitches that the reporter said, hey, here's some stories I want to cover. And the editor says, you cover this one, don't cover that, don't cover that, don't cover that, don't cover that, don't cover that.
No, I think it's more insidious than that now. Maybe at one point it was like that, but now it's like you see in journalism. Journalists are seeking to, they start with a narrative and then they look for facts to support their narrative. Especially with fact checking, we see that too. It's more narrative.
I do feel like I've seen that, but like a less cynical approach is just simply the objective reality of you pitch a lot of stories and only one of them gets chosen, right? And so over time, all the things that get omitted, they never make the news. They never make any of the major news.
But a more cynical approach, they're all communists.
Yeah.
But this is important because if this is an ideological battle with communist China, that means the United States has to have some ideological alternative that is worth standing up and fighting for, and not just a managed decline.
Even saying that, though, Chris, doesn't that sound somehow?
It sounds awesome.
Yes, and I think we talk about this in the book as well. One of the solutions is we need to be able to combat this ideological, educational assault wave, if you will, with our own political warfare capabilities. We need to be able to have a government that's willing to challenge the Chinese on this ideological front and to confront when they lie, when China Daily or People's Daily or whatever it is, or when they're up in their spokesman or making a statement. We need to be able to have a government that has the capacity to call out these actions that they're doing. So I've called for years about why aren't we reporting more on what the Chinese is doing with their military inside the first island chain when they are, threatening our allies in the Philippines or in Japan. We should be reporting that, not sensationalizing, just the facts of, so that we can get it on the official record, so that then the journalists and the academic community can collate that information and start reporting out trend lines of what the Chinese are doing. But we've kind of tended to not do that. Now, there's been some recent national defense authorization bills, and there's been some efforts at the State Department with the Global Awareness Center and things of that nature. But it seems to be, what you guys are saying is that they seem to be more focused on silencing dis, and false information amongst Americans than they are about calling out bold-faced lies from the Chinese Communist Party and the threats that they are doing, or the lies about how their system is a superior system. As Brad likes to say, their system is going to fall in the ash heap of history because communism is a failed, illegitimate system. And the Chinese Communist Party is a illegitimate government. They don't belong there. Marxism is from Germany, right? Marxist Leninists and Stalinists are Germans and Russian ideologies. So why are Chinese people, being led by that? If I was Chinese, I'd be like, why am I following this guy around, Karl Marx? They don't get it. Now, they've tried to, over the years, they've done a very good job of propagandizing that to say it's really communist with Chinese characteristics. But the fact of the matter is it's an illegitimate government. It's an illegitimate form of governance. It's failed miserably throughout history. It's dangerous. It's killed millions of people. And our system has proven to be very effective and helped more people around the world than any other system. So we have a lot to be positive about. We have a lot to talk about. Let's do it.
Well, so why do we need to worry about communist China if, it's doomed to the ash heap of history, if it's a corrupt system that's going to collapse?
Well, it only collapses if there is an alternative there, that they can see that there's an alternative system that can compete against it. And competing requires taking some effort.
Well, so I know your book talks a bit about some of the solutions. I'd like to talk about that. And also just what happens if, does the Chinese Communist Party need the U.S. to push against it for it to collapse? What if the system just collapses under the weight of itself? We've seen a lot of really severe economic troubles in China, a lot of social unrest happening.
I'm of the opinion that we have to contribute to their downfall. I'm not talking about regime change. I'm not talking about putting troops in China. That's not the issue. The issue is to draw a stark distinction between the advantages of freedom and liberty versus collectivism and slavery under a single-party state. That's the distinction that needs to be drawn ideologically. In terms of military competition, well, we need to be able to make them rethink that they can just march through Taiwan, the Senkakus, or the Indian border, or Mongolia, and just take people and do it without any cost. There has to be a cost for them. They have to really believe that there's going to be a dangerous existential cost to them for taking those kinds of actions. And we haven't done that. So it requires, in terms of solutions, it requires our nation to get back to what we had done in the Cold War, which is to make sure that we had a credible conventional and nuclear force structure. And conventional forces, that seems fairly easy to people in terms of why you would need it. Very costly, and it's going to take a lot of time to get it. If we want to start producing aircraft carriers like we did in 1940, with the Two Ocean Navy Act, we're going to have new shipyards, and we're going to have more labor to be able to do that. We're going to have less regulations from the government, more incentivization from the government to get those things built, and that's going to take time. And if we think that China's getting ready to invade Taiwan in this decade of concern that we talked about before and in this book, then we're going to have to think something different. We're going to have to be innovative. And the area that's probably the most controversial in the book, and I say it out here right now, is that we need to start talking with our allies and partners in Asia about the introduction of theater and tactical nuclear weapons in Taiwan or in Japan or in Korea, not to force it on them, not to mandate it, but to have those conversations because we have allies and friends that aren't going to be able to take advantage of our conventional military force that's so depleted right now, and it's going to take too long to build it up. So we need to start having those conversations in public now, because we need to make Beijing understand that we're serious about this, that it's a no-go zone, and if they go there, that they have to consider what we'll do with nuclear weapons. And that sounds provocative to people. It sounds escalatory. And I always like to remind people, well, yeah, I can understand why you'd think that's provocative or escalatory. But again, in the last 3 years, the PRC and the PLA built 350 ICBM silos in central and western China, 300 to 350. And they have the DF-41 intercontinental ballistic missile. Those missiles are designed to fly over the pole and nuke the United States of America, where we're sitting right now. And those missiles have somewhere between 3, 6, or 10 independent reentry vehicles. So we're talking literally potentially thousands of warheads that could rain down on us. They built that. Now, I know there's reports in Bloomberg that say that, well, there's a leaked intelligence report that says that they're having problems and they filled up their missiles with water and not fuel. Well, the fact of the matter is the DF-41's a solid fuel missile, not a liquid fueled missile. So, and this idea of threat deflating again comes into play, downplaying the threat. The fact is, Chinese have built their nuclear arsenal. The arsenal is real, and they have done it while we have not changed our nuclear arsenal. So I don't accept any criticism that says we're provocative if we talk about putting nukes in Taiwan. What we're talking about is last-ditch measures almost to be able to save the people of Taiwan from a potential catastrophic invasion or a blackmailed invasion that China could use by saying, hey, America, if you get involved with this internal PRC police action against a rogue province, we'll use nukes on you. Well, we need to have something that would counter their ability to say that with no worry.
Right. I mean,
because Taiwan would have nukes themselves. And
Correct.
so there's no point in threatening the U.S. Right. That's a good idea. I like it.
Well, but there's also, there's a few things between, backing off from the Scarborough Shoal and deploying nukes, right? So, you talk about how, well, China will push and push and push with the PLA militarizing islands and stuff. What would you say would be a good tactic if the United States was willing to push back, for example, on the militarization of the South China Sea, but without it actually coming to nuking or even actually blowing things up?
Right. And yeah, that's a good point on the nukes. I mean, people hear nuke and they just think theater nuclear warfare, blow up the planet. Well, in the Cold War against the Soviets, we had gradations of nuclear options and capabilities. Just in the nuclear arena, there was a scale that had, over 100 possibilities of ratcheting up, the deterrent force. But in the conventional arena, a simple thing we could do, the Philippines, our ally, our treaty ally, is being threatened on a daily basis at Second Thomas Shoal, right? They're preventing the Republic of the Philippines from providing food and water and access to those sailors on board the Sierra Madre. Well, why isn't the U.S. 7th Fleet down there with a destroyer doing vertical replenishment, VertRep? Do we really think the Chinese are going to...
For our viewers, VertRep is what?
Vertical replenishment.
So they're just dropping it down, basically.
They come off our ship with a sack of goodies, food and water and mail, and come over the Sierra Madre and drops it on them. Not drops it, lowers it down, and they they pick up their stuff. You could do it that way instead of trying to do it via a small boat that the Chinese Coast Guard is ramming.
We're talking doing it by like helicopter or something?
It's helicopters,
Okay.
yeah. It's helicopter. We could do that. We could assist the Philippines in doing that. We could escort up to a point their small boats that are going to the Second Thomas Shoal, the Sierra Madre. We could escort them. Other things, we could sail our ships much closer into the disputed territories that China has in the South China Sea. In the East China Sea, the Japanese Coast Guard is, China has said we're going to now go every day inside the contiguous zone in this year with their Coast Guard inside the Senkakus, which is administered by Japan. We could help assist our Japanese allies a little bit more. There's all kinds of things that we could do. The Chinese say they don't like us flying reconnaissance operations, which we usually fly, 100 miles or more off the coast of China. Well, we could fly them much closer. We could just say, hey, you told us you're telling us where to operate in the international airspace. Well, we're not going to listen to you. On every front, we could challenge them in ways that are, as to use their tactic back at them. We could use salami slicing tactics back to them. We could salami slice what they've already taken over the years. For instance, they have these balloons that are flying over Taiwan. Well, we could put a destroyer, a U.S. Aegis destroyer, inside the Taiwan Strait, and when those balloons come across, we could just start shooting them down. It's a balloon. There's no people on the balloon, so we're not killing anybody. But we could just tell China. Now, that would be stupid in a longer term scenario because our missiles cost much more probably than the balloon. But the point is, you could make an overt, demonstration of America's intent. And lastly, what we can do is that we can finally end this policy of strategic ambiguity. We can just come out and say, hey, we're not ambiguous anymore. Taiwan is a real nation. It meets all the criteria. It's a peaceful place. It's a democracy. It's got its own borders. It's got its own economy. It's got its own government system. It's got its own military, and they're not harming anybody. So we recognize that. That's a reality. It's like saying the sun comes up in the east. Yep, that's right. It does.
So big picture, what else should the anyone listening get from the book before obviously you go and buy the book and read it yourself?
Well, thank you for that. The main thing is that we have to recognize the Chinese Communist Party is an ideological adversary in every way that word means, that their ideology drives everything that they do, and that they've been on a pathway since Mao to Xi to achieve what they believe is their rightful position in the world, to run and rule the world. And they don't want to be opposed, and the only nation that can oppose them is the United States of America. And for too long, we have had people that should have been, and their responsibility was to defend this nation against such a threat. For too long, those people have told us to engage with and embrace Chinese communists. And we need to stop that as a nation. We need to have leadership that can come in and do what kind of like Ronald Reagan did with the Soviet Union and say, I don't want to have détente and mutual, status quo with the Soviet Union. I want to defeat them. We need somebody that's going to come in and say, we have to defeat the PRC. We have to defeat it, and we're going to put them on the ash heap of history, and we're going to do it through these, a strategy and a plan that's a whole of government, to use a phrase that's a trope out there, but really that way, where we're approaching it from not just a military confrontation or an economic confrontation, but an ideological and information. We need to protect our education. We need to teach our children the values of the Constitution and the Declaration, how this nation was formed. I mean, being in this area where we are, we're around where this nation was formed. That's important that we remember why we were formed, what we were formed for, so that we could be independent people, free to say what we want, to believe what we want, to associate with whomever we want, and not to have a government force it down our throat. And we're seeing too much of that in America today. It's dangerous. We shouldn't adopt communism. We shouldn't adopt one-party state rule where the state is our nanny and tells us what's good for us. You can't have this stove. You have to have this kind of stove. You shouldn't have this car. You should have that kind of car. Don't eat meat, eat bugs, all that stuff. Hey, mutilate your children. we're telling you, you must mutilate your children, or you're an educator and you're telling people, parents, you have no rights. But the whole thing about mutilation and the government forcing that and telling parents they don't have a right to tell their kids what to do that's just crazy. And we're adopting these policies and this top-down control process, and it's infecting us. It's weakening us, and that's part of it. TikTok's being used to demoralize and
brainwash,
and brainwash and weaken our will to have resolve. I mean, and oh, by the way, when you say you like independence and freedom and liberty, there's a responsibility that comes with that, because that's what you're saying is I can take care of my own self better than the government can. Well, that means you're going to have to go get a job, and you're going to have to work hard, and you're going to have to be responsible, and you're going to have to delay gratification and save your dollars and things of that nature. And it seems hopeless to young people today. I know that. They're like, I can't ever afford to have a house. I can't afford to, do anything. There's no hope. So I might as well have a government check, and I can just play video games and veg out in the basement somewhere. We have to reverse this mindset. So it's confronting China, but it's also reminding ourselves of our own heritage. And we can do it. We've done a lot worse in the last 250 years. As Brad likes to say, the Declaration was signed by 56 people. And look what it brought. 56 people. I like to talk about there were 12 guys with a guy in a boat in Galilee, and they did something too. So we don't need millions of people to get on board immediately.
One of those guys was a little...
But anyway, the point is that small numbers of people that get that idea of liberty and freedom can actually do a lot. And that's what we need to do.
Well, earlier in the podcast, you used the analogy of rust. And I think that's a great analogy, because it breaks stuff down. And most importantly, rust is dirty and it's red. Thank you very much for joining us once again, Jim. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
It's been my honor. Thanks, guys.
Once again, the book is Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. Check it out. It's available wherever books are sold.
Correct.
Once again, I'm Chris Chappell.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
We'll talk to you next time.